The summer of 1877 came and went in Dodge City, Kansas. It was the second major cattle season in the newest hub for Texas cattle on the Southern Plains, a town that was sometimes called the Queen of the Cow Towns, and sometimes called the wickedest town in the West. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and a collection of other now famous lawmen kept the peace as best they could. And when the season reached its traditional end in September or early October, the town quieted down substantially. It wasn't uncommon for the lawmen to venture out on other opportunities, whether it was judicial business or just trying to make a personal fortune in the gold fields of Deadwood. Wyatt Earp's adventure during the early winter months was to hunt an outlaw. He certainly wasn't opposed to chasing a fortune. After 2 more seasons in Dodge, he would turn in his badge and head to Tombstone to try to get rich mining the miners. But in early November 1877, he had been given a temporary appointment as a deputy U.S. Marshal, in addition to his regular duties as a lawman in Dodge, for the express purpose of arresting one man, David Rudabaugh. Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, as he would be known, had robbed a railroad camp in Kansas a month earlier, and the Santa Fe Railroad wanted him caught and punished. Wyatt had now tracked the desperado hundreds of miles south to the raucous town of Fort Griffin, Texas. Like many communities in Texas, a town had grown up around a military outpost that had been constructed to protect settlers from the Comanche and Kiowa attacks on the western frontier. Wyatt had been in the saddle for the better part of a month, and when he stepped down to the dirt street of Fort Griffin, he headed for the biggest joint in town, the Beehive Saloon. Dave Rudabaugh was an avid gambler, and if he was in Fort Griffin, there was a good chance he was in the Beehive. Earp had known the saloon's owner, John Shancy, for years. Shancy had been a professional boxer, and Wyatt had officiated some of his matches. The saloon keeper told Wyatt that the outlaw had been in his saloon, but the stern and serious-looking fugitive had left town earlier that week, and Shancy had no clue where he went. Beyond that, Shancy could only direct Wyatt to a lean gambler in the saloon who had played cards with Rudabaugh on a few occasions. The gambler was also a dentist and an impressive drinker, and reportedly a hell of a pistol shot. He had drifted west from his home state of Georgia after running into some trouble with the law, and he also hoped the drier climate would help his tuberculosis. Wyatt strolled over to the gambler, who gave a salutation and introduced himself as John Henry Holliday. Holliday would pass along a little bit of information about the fugitive, but the more important development, though neither man knew it at the time, of course, was that the lawman and this sickly, hard-drinking, hard-gambling dentist had just formed one of the legendary friendships in American history, all because of a 2-bit thief named Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. From Black Barrel Media, this is Legends of the Old West. I'm your host, Chris Wimmer, and this season we're telling the stories of infamous outlaws Charlie Bowles, better known as Black Bart, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, and the Doolin Dalton Gang. This is Episode 3, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, Part 1 of 2, Rustler and Robber. Most everything about David Rudabaugh, even his nickname, is shrouded in a degree of mystery. The most common story about his nickname was that it was literal and obvious. He didn't bathe very often, and he wore nasty clothes that had never been to a laundry in their existence. A few newspapers put forward that claim, but whether it's true or accurate is anyone's guess. He was also known as Arkansas Dave Rudabaugh, which was a much easier nickname to track based on upcoming events. Regardless, he was a cowboy turned outlaw who seemed to hit every hot spot in the West during his short life. It's generally believed that Dave Rudabaugh was born in Fulton County, Illinois, in the summer of 1854. He would have turned 7 years old when the Civil War started, and the war hit his family hard, like it did many others. His father was killed during the fighting, and as a result, the Rudabaugh family drifted from place to survive. As soon as Dave was able, he started working odd jobs to bring in money. And, like many young men of the era, when he reached his teenage years, he left home and headed west. It was the early 1870s, and Dave joined throngs of young men in Kansas who worked on the cattle trails. He was a decent cowboy, but he quickly tired of the challenging labor. He worked as a message carrier, but that job required hours in the saddle just like a cowboy. Rudabaugh tried his hand at bartending in some of the rowdy saloons in the cow towns of Kansas, but that didn't suit him either. He had some mild success as a buffalo hunter, like Bat Masterson, but by the mid-1870s, Dave Rudabaugh was officially done with honest work. He decided a life of crime would pay much better. In Arkansas, Rudabaugh dove into the cattle rustling business. From western Arkansas, he could quickly drive cattle to Texas, Missouri, Kansas, or Indian Territory, the future state of Oklahoma. The buyers either didn't know or didn't care that the animals were stolen, and Dave could make relatively fast money. In short order, he teamed up with two more shady characters, Milton Yarberry and Dave Mather. Yarberry was a native of Arkansas and a known killer. He gunned down his first man at the age of 24. Dave Mather, also called Mysterious Dave Mather, was a shadowy figure who was a gunman and a con man as well as a rustler. Dirty Dave and his companions became a notorious squad of rustlers, but their time together was brief. It ended when the authorities believed they shot and killed a local rancher who was protecting his herd. The three men scattered, and it appears as though Dave headed north to Deadwood during its earliest days as an outlaw mining town in 1876. It's believed that Dirty Dave tried to become a stagecoach robber, but he was far less successful than a masked bandit in Northern California who had robbed his first stagecoach the previous year. Unlike Charlie Bowles, also known as Black Bart, Dave Rudabaugh quickly gave up on robbing stages. He returned to Kansas, where the newest jewel on the plains was Dodge City. There, south of the informal dividing line between the respectable part of town and the disreputable part of town, known as the Front Street Deadline, he found plenty of drinking, cursing, carousing, and fighting. Dirty Dave Rudabaugh assembled a new group of cattle rustlers in Dodge City shortly after his arrival. Nicknamed the Trio, the gang consisted of Dave and two veteran criminals, Mike Rourke and Dan Dement. Dave assumed the leadership role, as he had ample experience in cattle rustling, and he could boast that he had killed a man in Arkansas if anyone second-guessed him. The trio gained reputations as hard cases in 1876 and 1877. They preyed on the huge cattle herds which were driven up from Texas, and they quickly rallied other rustlers to their banner. When the gang grew in size, it had to drop the nickname the Trio. They became the Rudabaugh Rourke Gang, and they decided to expand their criminal enterprise from cattle rustling to armed robbery. Their first target was a camp of workers for the Santa Fe Railroad. In October 1877, Dirty Dave and his gang rushed into a construction camp outside Dodge City that belonged to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, otherwise known as the Santa Fe Railroad. In a somewhat strange quirk of the times, no one knows exactly what the gang stole. The obvious assumption is that it was money, but it could have been other assorted valuables. Either way, they took a lot of it and enraged the railroad in the process. Dodge City Mayor James Kelly requested a temporary appointment from the U.S. Marshal for local lawman Wyatt Earp. Wyatt became a deputy U.S. Marshal for the express purpose of tracking down the Rudabaugh Rourke gang, specifically Dave Rudabaugh. As Wyatt went out on the hunt, Dave and his cronies scattered. Dave fled to Texas. His first stop was a hamlet called Clear Fork, which was probably west of Fort Worth. After that, he rode to Fort Griffin and spent some amount of time playing cards with Doc Holliday. Meanwhile, Wyatt Earp doggedly tracked the outlaw through Kansas, Indian Territory, and then down into Texas. According to some sources, Wyatt was paid $10 a day during his pursuit of Dave Rudabaugh. To many folks in Kansas, that was not nearly enough money to justify the effort. But Wyatt did it anyway. Dave Rudabaugh escaped Fort Griffin within a week of Wyatt Earp arriving. When Wyatt talked to Doc Holliday, the dentist and shootist told him that he had played cards with the fugitive, and depending on the count you believe, they made a deal. Doc taught Dave tricks to improve his poker skills, and Dave shared some tricks for how to be better with a pistol. Doc told Wyatt that he believed Dave took off northward from Fort Griffin and that he was going back to Dodge City. Wyatt thanked Doc for the information, and he went to the local telegraph office to wire his friend and fellow lawman, Bat Masterson, to be on the lookout for Dirty Dave. Dave took a long time to get back to Kansas, and when he did, it was late December or early January. Winters on the open prairie were harsh, with freezing temperatures, constant wind, and plenty of snow. There were no cattle to rustle, so Dave proposed an idea that some of his friends loved and others hated. Instead of robbing a railroad camp, they would rob a train. Dave's partner, Mike Rourke, didn't like the idea. The gang had caught hell for stealing from a construction site. What would the railroad do if they robbed an actual train? Besides, if the train had money worth stealing, it would be in a safe and protected by armed guards. Rourke thought it was a ridiculous idea. Rudabaugh argued that they needed money, and most of the gang agreed with him, but they conceded that they would need to steer clear of Dodge City. The town was packed with lawmen, and if the gang successfully pulled this off, they would need a good head start to get away. Dave and the gang decided the ideal spot was the tiny railroad town of Kinsley, Kansas, roughly 36 miles northeast of Dodge City. On January 27, 1878, Dave Rudabaugh led 5 gang members to Kinsley. It appears as though Mike Rourke went along despite his protests, probably because the robbery was going to happen anyway, and he might as well try to get something out of it. The goal was to rob the train when it stopped at the water tank east of town. Since trains were propelled by steam, a locomotive needed water as well as coal to push itself down the tracks. But the plan relied on a pivotal assumption: that every train on the line would stop at the water tank. Dave's crew set up near the water tank and watched as the next train on the tracks chugged right past them. The 6 outlaws waited for another train to come along, but none did, and the frigid weather forced them to make a decision. They would take over the town's train station and wait indoors for their chance at a big robbery. Or if worse came to worst, they would rob the train station and at least get something out of the deal. As it happened, they did both. Dirty Dave barged through the station's doors and found the night operator. With guns drawn, Dave and his men demanded that the station operator fork over all the money in the station office. Even with a gun in his face, the man said there was no money in the safe, and he also had no way of opening it. Dave apparently believed the operator, who must have been a decent liar because there was, in fact, more than $2,000 in the safe. As the outlaws began to curse their situation, they heard the shrill whistle of a train. The gang dragged the operator out onto the train platform and waited for the westbound train to pull into the station. 6 outlaws and 1 hostage stood on the platform at Kinsley Station and watched the train roll toward them with plumes of smoke spewing from the smokestack on the locomotive. And then, the operator ran. He broke away from the bandits and ran toward the train to warn the engineer. He rushed across the tracks, waving his arms and shouting, and one of the gang members fired a shot. The shot missed the station operator, but it drew the attention of some of the brakemen on the train. They pulled some of the brakes, and the train glided past the outlaws and stopped roughly 100 yards beyond the station's platform. The robbery mission certainly wasn't going according to plan, but the outlaws adapted quickly. They ran toward the train, and the 2 in the lead climbed into the locomotive. They ordered the engineer to move the train farther out of the station so the outlaws could take what they wanted in the remote landscape of Kansas. The engineer claimed he didn't have enough steam, and they had to wait. Meanwhile, 2 robbers went to the express car, and 2 more boarded the passenger cars. The bandits who went to the express car found the side door already open. The guard inside was holding a lantern. When he saw the outlaws coming, he tossed the lantern out of the car in order to darken his position. Then he opened fire. The outlaws fired back, but no one could see clearly in the darkness, and the bullets ricocheted all around them. As the 2 outlaws started to shoot it out with the express guard, the pair of bandits who boarded the passenger cars were about to start robbing the travelers. But when the outlaws heard the gunshots, they scrambled out of the passenger car and ran down the platform to see what was happening. Likewise, the 2 bandits in the locomotive heard the gunfire, jumped off the train, and ran to the express car. The engineer, who may have had plenty of steam and had been bluffing the bandits, cranked up the engine, and the train started rolling out of Kinsley. The 2 outlaws who had exchanged gunfire with the express guard jumped off the train as it started to lurch out of town. Dave and his men ran to their horses, and if they'd had fleeting thoughts about chasing the train, they quickly abandoned the idea. The train chugged out of town and into the flat, dark landscape of western Kansas. When the engineer felt they were out of danger, he stopped the train and checked on the passengers and the express car. To his surprise and probably his delight, no one was injured and not a single item was stolen. Dirty Dave Rudabaugh and his men had completely botched their heist. Dave's second foray into serious crime in Kansas meant he was now going to be chased by Bat Masterson. That would put the outlaw in an elite club of men who had been chased by Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp. Although the attempted robbery happened in Edwards County, Kansas, Ford County Sheriff Bat Masterson was tasked with capturing the thieves. The 2 counties are right next to each other. Edwards County was sparsely populated and had comparatively little in the way of law enforcement, while Ford County, where Dodge City was located, was overflowing with top-notch lawmen. The gang naturally had a head start on Bat, but the outlaws would not have known, at least not right away, that Bat was assigned to their case. Regardless of what they knew or didn't, they made the curious decision to ride toward Dodge City instead of scattering into the wilds of the southern plains. A few of the robbers went straight into Dodge, but Dave Rudabaugh and Edgar West wisely bypassed the town. They rode 30 miles south of Dodge through the worsening weather. When they made it to a village called Crooked Creek, about 25 miles from the Oklahoma border, a blizzard slammed into southern Kansas. The bandits holed up in Crooked Creek to wait out the storm, but Bat Masterson and 3 deputies pushed through the dangerous conditions. One of those deputies was Josh Webb, who would undergo a transformation over the next couple years while he worked with both Bat Masterson and Dave Rudabaugh. Somehow, the lawmen tracked Dave and Edgar through the storm and ended up in Crooked Creek. The tiny town was built on the site of an old Comanche buffalo hunting camp, but by 1878, the Comanche and the buffalo were gone. The effort of the lawmen and their grueling journey through the blizzard paid off. When the lawmen arrived in Crooked Creek, they spotted Dirty Dave and Edgar West with ease. There are no details of the arrest, but it would stand to reason that the posse found the fugitives keeping warm in a saloon or a boarding house. Wherever it happened, Masterson arrested the robbers and dragged them back to Dodge as soon as the weather cleared. The other robbers were eventually arrested, and it appears as though 2 of them made it easy on the authorities by being overly rowdy in a dance hall in Dodge. They were arrested for a minor charge, which then became more serious after Bat Masterson interrogated Dirty Dave Rudabaugh. As Masterson pressured Rudabaugh, Rudabaugh agreed to reveal the names of his Confederates, as well as testify against them in court if he could go free. The deal was done. Everyone went to jail except Dave. And ironically, Dave went to work for the railroad that he had just tried to rob. A year later, in the early spring of 1879, the Santa Fe Railroad hired Bat Masterson in an effort to win a tense contest that became known as the Royal Gorge War. Two railroads, the Santa Fe and the Denver and Rio Grande Western, were competing to lay tracks to the silver mining boomtown of Leadville in the Rocky Mountains south of Denver. The Santa Fe hired Masterson to recruit a group of gunfighters to help secure exclusive passage to the silver mines. Masterson brought in several notable figures from Western lore: Doc Holliday, who had been living in Dodge City; Ben Thompson, who had saved Bat's life in Texas after Bat had been shot in a saloon; Josh Webb, Bat's colleague in Kansas; Mysterious Dave Mather, Dave Rudabaugh's former partner; and Dirty Dave Rudabaugh himself. The goal of both railroads was to be the exclusive line to Leadville. The best way to get to Leadville was to follow the Arkansas River up into the mountains. The key to controlling a path along the Arkansas River was a canyon called Royal Gorge, about 30 miles outside of the city of Pueblo. Royal Gorge was the prize, but the famous conflict of the struggle was in Pueblo. Gunmen roamed the rail lines in southeastern Colorado and braced for a fight, while lawyers representing the competing railroads filed lawsuits in court. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had its crews build small forts out of stone in strategic locations to make it difficult for the Santa Fe Railroad to move in on them. There were smaller clashes in those areas, but the big one happened in June 1879 in Pueblo. Masterson and his 60 hired gunmen, including Rudabaugh, Holliday, Thompson, Mather, and Webb, went to Pueblo and took up defensive positions in the roundhouse of the Santa Fe Railroad station. At the same time, upwards of 100 men from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad arrived in town. Besides having more men, the Denver and Rio Grande recruited the county sheriff and the town marshal to its side. The lawmen were willing to give the Denver and Rio Grande a cannon from a nearby armory to dislodge the gunmen in the roundhouse. The problem was that Masterson had already taken the cannon from the armory. It was in the roundhouse with Dirty Dave and the gunslingers who worked for the Santa Fe Railroad. The loss of the cannon was disappointing to the Denver and Rio Grande faction, but they still had plenty of rifles and ammunition. The most common story is that the Denver and Rio Grande faction stormed the Santa Fe Railroad station. Both sides opened fire. The DRG faction charged into the telegraph office of the Santa Fe station and forced Masterson's men from their positions. As the sporadic gunfire continued, Masterson's men fell back. Masterson's crew had the cannon, but they didn't use it, possibly because of the speed of the assault, or possibly because the use of the cannon would have led to excessive carnage. The battle, which might be a strong label, quickly fell apart for Masterson, Rudabaugh, and the Santa Fe men. They scrambled out of the back of the roundhouse and the Santa Fe station and lived to handle the situation another way. Reportedly, Masterson and one of the leaders of the DRG faction met and called a truce after the action. Fighting was largely pointless, as the argument could only be resolved by the bosses in court. The following year, in 1880, the two railroads reached a settlement, which awarded the right-of-way to the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, but required the DRG to pay the Santa Fe Railroad for all the work the Santa Fe had done up to that point. Dave Rudabaugh's participation was done, and he, like many others, drifted south from Colorado to the bustling town of Las Vegas, New Mexico. Dave's new friend, Josh Webb, had gone down to Las Vegas after the action in Pueblo, and Dave followed suit. Webb's full name was John Joshua Webb, and, like Dave, Webb had lived his life on both sides of the law. In Las Vegas, Webb would do both at the same time. Las Vegas was a big town for the region, thanks to the Santa Fe Railroad, and it boasted some of the finest amenities of any town in the Southwest. It had a library, a college, and an opera house. And for those who preferred less refined entertainment, it had a bunch of saloons. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, it attracted every form of lawbreaker, from confidence men who ran scams on civilians, to crooked gamblers, to gunfighters, to rustlers and robbers of every stripe. Josh Webb opened a saloon with Doc Holliday as a partner. Doc Holliday and his girlfriend, Kate Elder, set up shop in Las Vegas for a time, while his friends, the Earp clan, left Dodge City for Tombstone, Arizona. By the time Dave Rudabaugh landed in Las Vegas, the town was firmly controlled by a powerful crime syndicate called the Dodge City Gang. There was nothing especially clever about the nickname the Dodge City Gang. Most of its members, like Dave Rudabaugh, had strong ties to the Kansas cowtown. In Las Vegas, many of the members held prominent roles in town, and the gang's unquestioned leader was Hyman Neal, who was nicknamed Hoodoo Brown. Hoodoo Brown was a known gambler and scam artist who had tried to strike it rich in Colorado as a silver miner. He arrived in Las Vegas in the late 1870s and soon became the town coroner and then the mayor. When Dirty Dave rode into Las Vegas, probably in the summer or fall of 1879, Brown was the justice of the peace, and other members of the gang ran the marshal's office. Crime was certainly punished in Las Vegas, unless it was sanctioned by Hoodoo Brown and the Dodge City Gang. The situation was similar to the one that was reported in Montana in the early 1860s. Henry Plummer was a county sheriff who definitely maintained law and order, but he was also accused of being the leader of an outlaw gang that robbed and killed all over the territory. In Las Vegas, the Dodge City Gang's activities will always be disputed, but it was alleged that they could get away with anything, including murder. Most of the time, anyway. In late January 1880, about 6 months after the gun battle in Pueblo, Colorado, Hyman Neal was the justice of the peace in Las Vegas. Joe Carson was the town marshal, and Josh Webb was a policeman. On January 22nd, 4 cowboys were acting overly rowdy. Marshal Joe Carson brought Rudabaugh's former partner, Dave Mather, with him to confront the cowboys at a place called Close and Patterson's Variety Hall. There has never been confirmation on whether or not Dave Mather was an official deputy, but he supported the marshal regardless of his legal standing. The confrontation at the Variety Hall led to a shootout and an escalating series of bloody events. Marshal Carson was killed shortly after the gunfire started. Dave Mather killed one of the cowboys and wounded at least one other. The injured man was thrown in jail, and the 2 remaining cowboys fled town. The fugitive cowboys were caught 2 weeks later and thrown in jail with their friend, but they didn't stay there for very long. A lynch mob dragged them out of jail and hanged all 3 cowboys. It was rumored that Dave Rudabaugh was part of the mob. Rudabaugh apparently committed all manner of crimes that were sanctioned by the gang. Working alongside seasoned criminals like Dutchie Schunderberger and quasi-lawman Dave Mather, Rudabaugh participated in robberies, stole horses, and possibly committed murder. Whenever honest citizens of Las Vegas complained about the killings, Hoodoo Brown placed men like Dave on the town coroner's jury. In most cases, shootings that were blamed on a member of the Dodge City Gang were ruled as justifiable acts of self-defense. So it's not surprising that Hyman Neal and Josh Webb thought the self-defense tactic would work in March 1880. After Marshal Joe Carson was killed in the Variety Hall shootout, Josh Webb became the new marshal. On March 3rd, at 4 o'clock in the morning, according to the Las Vegas Daily Optic newspaper, Marshal Webb and a couple deputies entered a saloon and confronted a group of 3 men. The apparent leader of the trio, Michael Kelleher, was wearing a gun. Like many towns in the West, it was illegal to carry guns in town, though the Dodge City Gang, which controlled the law in Las Vegas, openly disregarded the ordinance. The newspaper said Webb told Kelleher to give up his gun. Kelleher refused and supposedly made a motion to draw. Webb shot Kelleher 3 times, and Kelleher fell dead on the saloon floor. Now, all of that is probably accurate, but the newspaper also noted that Keller had $1,900 on his person when he died. The deeper story was that at least some of that money was owed to Hoodoo Brown. So, folks in Las Vegas started to believe that Brown had instructed Webb to kill Kelleher for the money. Marshal Josh Webb was arrested for murder, likely by the county sheriff, which presumably was an office that was not controlled by the Dodge City gang. Webb was thrown in the same jail from which 3 cowboys had been dragged 6 weeks earlier. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Dave Rudabaugh did not want his friend to face the drop, so Dave started organizing a breakout. Like most things in Dave's criminal career, it went wrong. Fatally wrong this time. Next time on Legends of the Old West, Dave Rudabaugh orchestrates a jailbreak that ends in murder. The Dodge City gang implodes, and Dave goes to Lincoln County, where he teams up with Billy the Kid just in time to be chased by Sheriff Pat Garrett. After another jailbreak, Dave heads down to Mexico for his last hurrah. That's next week on Legends of the Old West. Members of our Black Barrel Plus program don't have to wait week to week to receive new episodes. They receive the entire season to binge all at once with no commercials. And they also receive exclusive bonus episodes. Sign up now through the link in the show notes or on our website, blackbarrelmedia.com. Memberships are just $5 per month. This series was researched and written by Michael Meglish. The producer was Joe Guerra. Original music by Rob Valier. I'm Chris Wimmer. Thanks for listening.